Good evening. Tonight, we're stepping into the cold stone corridors of a medieval English castle where power, betrayal, and brutality collide in the shadows behind locked doors. Picture this, a September night in the year 1327. In the dark, damp prison of Berkeley Castle. There are no candles, only the flickering flame of a torch and the echo of dripping water breaking the silence. Somewhere in that stillness, a king, once crowned with sacred authority, is waiting to die. And not just any king, but Edward II. They say history is written by the victors, but some stories aren't written in ink. They're etched in red-hot iron. What happened that night? Brutal, symbolic, and so grotesque, even the historians of the time weren't sure if it was fact or a waking nightmare. And yet, the tale has been whispered across centuries, not just as the downfall of a king, but as a warning to anyone who dares to misstep on the chessboard of power. Don't worry, you'll probably survive this story. Probably. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't be shy. Leave a comment below. Where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The night wind drifts softly across the moss-covered walls of Berkeley Castle, a place where time seems to have stopped. And every stone still holds the secret of a grim September night. Imagine this. You are standing in a narrow corridor, winding through solid stone. There's no electricity, only the dim, flickering glow of a torch dancing on cracked walls, the smell of dampness and cold ash, and at the end of the hallway, a rusted iron door, sealed with the weary sigh of time. Behind that door is not a criminal, but a king, a man who once ruled all of England, now sitting alone on an old wooden bed, head bowed, his black cloak dusty and wrinkled not from age, but from the bitterness built up over months of imprisonment. Edward Plantagenet, born into royal glory, once rode on horseback through the cheers of thousands of subjects. Now hears only the scratching of rats in the corners and the footsteps of guards changing shifts outside. His room, in truth, a torture chamber disguised, was placed right above the castle's sewer drain, where the air was always thick with the stench of rot and human waste. The wooden bed had no mattress. Meals came irregularly, sometimes a bowl of cold gruel, sometimes a piece of bread hard as stone. These weren't oversights, they were punishment. A slow humiliation, carefully designed. A death not by sword or axe, but by the slow decay of body and will. If you ever thought a king might be imprisoned in cleaner conditions, sorry. The Middle Ages were not kind to those who failed. How did Edward come to this point? The story begins with the very things people expected of him and the things he never wanted to become. Edward was the son of Edward I, known as Longshanks, a fierce king who crushed the Welsh and suppressed the Scots, and laid the foundation for a formidable military empire. His son, therefore, was expected to carry that legacy forward, to be a warrior king, decisive, fearsome, and never swayed by emotion. But Edward II was not that kind of man. Born in 1284, he preferred playing music to wielding a sword. He loved festivities, boating, and making friends with those outside the noble class. This disappointed his father and worried the nobility. A prince like that, how could he lead a kingdom? When his father died and Edward ascended the throne in 1307, many hoped the crown would make him grow up. But life is no fairy tale, and the crown only magnified his flaws. Soon after his coronation, Edward openly brought his closest companion, Piers Gaveston, into court, granting him titles, land, influence, and, more than anything, his heart, that relationship, whether you believe it was friendship or love, broke every unspoken rule of the medieval court. A king was not allowed to love someone more than the crown, and certainly not to empower someone seen as an outsider like Gaveston. The nobles were furious. They saw their influence threatened, the throne destabilized by personal affairs. They issued ultimatums. Edward refused, so they acted. Gaveston was exiled, then captured, and finally killed. Edward collapsed, but instead of changing course, he found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser, the younger, and the story repeated affection, favoritism, power defying both queen and court. The nobles were no longer just angry, they were afraid. They saw a king not just weak, but stubborn. A man like that could not remain on the throne. And Queen Isabella, oh, she didn't sit idly. Once a sharp, intelligent French princess, Isabella had initially supported her husband, but when she was pushed aside by Edward's favorites, she didn't cry. She quietly left England. In France, she allied with a powerful exile named Roger Mortimer, and from there, a plan for revolution began to take shape. Cold, quiet, like the night wind. If you feel time slowing down, if you hear the soft footsteps echoing through stone corridors, don't worry. The story is far from over, and we've only just stepped through the first gate. You're hearing the cautious steps gliding across cold stone floors. It's the sound of a plot growing, not loud like an invading army, but quiet like a whisper from the very person who once held your hand at a royal wedding. Yes, Queen Isabella was no longer the forgotten rose of the court. After arriving in France, she brought no tears, only resolve. In her eyes, there was no longer the patient gaze of a wife, but the cold gleam of a woman calculating her next move on the chessboard of power. And then she met him. Roger Mortimer, an English nobleman once imprisoned by Edward II in the Tower of London. How he escaped remains a mystery. But by the time he reached France, he was no longer a fugitive. He was a wolf waiting for the right moment. Two wounded souls, one by love, one by power, meeting in exile. And from that meeting, a relationship formed, both lovers and co-conspirators. Isabella and Mortimer began rewriting Edward's fate not with ink, but with steel and blood. They quietly gathered support. Disenfranchised English nobles, exiles burning with resentment, commoners weary from failed wars, heavy taxes, and a court that served only the king's favorites. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer left France. No fanfare, no grand army, just a small group. But like a single spark falling into a dry forest, the fire spread with terrifying speed. No one stood to defend Edward II. The people disliked him. The nobles despised him. Those who had once sworn loyalty now turned their backs without hesitation. The royal court unraveled so quickly, it was hard to believe. Within weeks, all of England belonged to Isabella. Edward fled. There is an image so quietly devastating: a king once seated on the throne of England slipping through villages, crossing forests and streams like a fugitive. No guards, no entourage, just a failed man, betrayed, hunted by his own wife. He tried to reach Wales, hoping to find a boat to Ireland, but it was too late. He was captured near L'Entresant, close to the Welsh border. There was no coronation ceremony to mark this ending, no loyal courtiers at his bedside, only cold chains, locked around the wrists of a man once considered God's anointed on earth. Now came the critical question: what do you do with a deposed king? Kill him? Too risky. A clear execution would turn him into a martyr, someone who died for the crown. Release him. Even riskier. As long as he lived, someone might try to restore him. And let's not forget his son. Edward III, was still too young to truly wield power. Everything rested in the hands of Isabella and Mortimer, and they understood this one day. If young Edward asked, "Where is my father?" they needed an answer that would silence him forever. So a decision was made: send Edward to an isolated place where no one knew exactly what happened and where everything could be arranged. Berkeley Castle. A name that sounds ordinary, but this was the stage for one of the most horrifying scenes in English royal history. The castle's lord, Thomas de Berkeley, was a nobleman with past grievances against Edward. He could be trusted. He could look the other way when needed. And the castle itself was quiet. Too quiet. There, Edward was held in a chamber above the castle's sewer. Damp, foul, no windows, no light, only decay. And time itself squeezing his will like a vice. Food was inconsistent. Sometimes watery gruel, sometimes moldy bread. At times, 2 full days passed with nothing but water. The room teemed with mosquitoes, rats, and whispers no one could trace. It wasn't a prison. It was a prolonged execution, not the destruction of a man by sword or spear, but by silence and erasure. From time to time, a guard would glance at him through the iron bars, saying nothing, just watching. Was it pity, curiosity, or simply marking the hour for his report? No one knows what he thought during those endless nights. Did he think of Gaveston? Did he remember his carefree days when he was a prince who loved boating and playing music? Or did he think of his son, wondering if the boy would ever know the truth day by day? Edward withered, in body and in spirit. But apparently, that wasn't enough. Isabella and Mortimer began to hear rumors that forces were gathering to rescue Edward, that foreign courts were starting to ask questions, that the shadow of the deposed king still stretched too long and too dangerously. And so the fateful night arrived. A night history could never confirm with certainty, but one that has been whispered about ever since. A night when fire wasn't just for warmth. The night wind pierced the stone walls of Berkeley Castle. The moon hid behind the clouds, as if even the sky did not wish to witness what was about to unfold. Inside the cell, Edward II, once King of England, once the one who sat on a throne, issued laws, and heard the cheers of his people, was now just a shadow. Thin, pale, his eyes sunken as if all light had abandoned him, his tattered black robe stained with dust, with the blotches of time and perhaps of dried tears. He no longer asked anything of anyone. He no longer pleaded. He simply sat there. They say that when a person gives up resistance, they're no longer truly alive, merely existing. And Edward had reached that point. A body still warm, but the monarchy within him had already collapsed. On a moonless night, the guards were rotated unusually. A few suddenly fell ill. Some unfamiliar faces appeared. Thomas de Berkeley, the lord of the castle, was away. Everything was arranged eerily smoothly. Then, they entered the cell. No one knows for certain who they were. No official records. No living witnesses. Only chronicles, some whispering, some doubting, some claiming. But all agree on one thing. Edward II did not die an ordinary death. The most horrific version, passed down through medieval chronicles, says he was killed with a red-hot poker thrust into his anus. An execution both monstrous and symbolic. No wounds visible. No blood on the floor. Only a strangled scream and the stench of burning flesh. Gruesome, isn't it? But in the thinking of the time, this method of killing wasn't just about ending a life. It was about humiliation. A revenge not only political, but sexual, masculine, dynastic. Think about it, a king rumored to have had same-sex relationships, killed by a weapon driven into his most private place. in silence, in shame, and with no one allowed to ask why. It wasn't just death. It was a message, and that message was, anyone who defies the new order, anyone who refuses to play the role assigned to them, will be erased from flesh to legacy. They say the prison cell fell into an unnatural silence after that final scream. No one rushed to remove the body. They waited until the dead of night, to let death cool, so that when Edward's body was found the next morning, it would be too late to do anything at all. The news that King Edward II had died of illness was sent to London the very next morning. Swiftly, almost as if it had been prepared in advance, the funeral was held with full honors. The body was embalmed, in the crude fashion of the time, just enough to preserve it for a few weeks. Just enough to hide any signs, if there were any. Mourners saw nothing unusual, just a king who looked tired. No one dared to ask further questions. Isabella and Mortimer made a public show of their grief. Proper, ceremonial. But everyone knew what they truly felt was relief. Their greatest threat was gone. But the story doesn't end there. Several soldiers who had once guarded Edward later disappeared. Some accidentally fell to their deaths. Others suddenly fell ill. Those present at Berkeley that night, none ever spoke again. And Thomas de Berkeley, he lived on, continued his political role, and consistently claimed he was not present that night. Did people believe him? Not exactly. But they stayed silent. And silence, sometimes, is the greatest power in a kingdom that has just changed hands. After that cold death in the stone prison of Berkeley, England held no prolonged moments of mourning, no grand investigation, no national outcry, only a suspicious hush. As if the entire country had chosen to look away, Isabella and Mortimer, the woman once pushed aside by court politics, and the man once a fugitive, now sat at the peak of power. Neither claimed the crown. They didn't need to. Edward II's son, the boy Edward III, only 14 years old, was crowned king. But everyone knew the real throne lay in the hands of his mother, Queen Regent Isabella, and behind her, like a long, ominous shadow, stood Roger Mortimer, her lover, and the one holding the reins of England's politics. And so, a throneless dynasty began. The reign of Isabella and Mortimer would later be called, with a quiet name, the Regency government, lasting from 1327 to 1330. Brief, but full of upheaval. They were monarchs in all but name, ruling with the bearing of kings. Isabella, the woman once dismissed by her husband, now commanded the court with icy composure. Her talent was undeniable. She understood law, diplomacy, and above all, how to make others silent in the public eye. At first, Isabella was seen as the strong woman who had saved England from a failed king. Under her regency, the country was initially reorganized with surprising efficiency. Order was restored. Certain taxes were reduced, and the court became more disciplined. She even signed a truce with France to secure the borders, a move that greatly pleased the nobility. And Roger Mortimer, he was a different story. If Isabella was the bright face of the new regime, then Mortimer was its shadow. He was granted the title of Earl of March, amassing castles, lands, and power to a degree no one, not even royalty, had ever held without wearing a crown. A man once branded a traitor now stood above princes of the blood. He began to act like a true king, handing down judgments, commanding the army, appointing officials, and most chilling of all, eliminating anyone who dared mention the name Edward II with the wrong tone. The nobility began to murmur. Have we simply traded one tyranny for another? Was Edward's death really just a coincidence, or was it part of a plan? But when you sit too close to power, you often stop hearing the sound of warnings. Mortimer and Isabella continued living in luxury, hosting banquets, reviewing troops, organizing grand festivals to project the image of a stable regime. They rebuilt palaces, upgraded royal residences, and, of course, accumulated wealth from all corners. The people were divided, some grateful for having been rescued from a failed king, others growing suspicious, especially as rumors of Edward II's death spread like dampness through castle walls unseen, yet felt by everyone. And then, as with all short-lived empires, the inevitable came. Edward III grew up. The 14-year-old boy became a 17-year-old man, no longer the obedient son signing documents under his mother's instruction. He began to watch, to listen, to think, and the first thing Edward III seemed to feel was the shame of a father's death. No one dared to question. No record states what Edward III thought, but his actions spoke for him. In 1330, in a quiet and precise coup, Edward III had Mortimer arrested in his own bedchamber at Nottingham Castle in the dead of night. No shouting, no swords drawn. 3 days later, Roger Mortimer was put on trial. The proceedings were swift. The main charges the murder of King Edward II and the abuse of power. There was no long defense. The verdict, public hanging, no pardon. Non noble privilege. And Isabella Edward didn't execute his mother. It was a decision both merciful and wise. But she was stripped of all authority and sent to live in the quiet residence of Castle Rising, not imprisoned, but no longer Queen of England. She lived many more years, in silence, occasionally hosting small gatherings, occasionally writing letters to her son, but never once mentioning the name Mortimer. And so, at last, England once again had a true king on the throne, not placed there by others, but one who had seized it with his own hands, Edward III. Only 18, but with eyes no longer of a boy coming of age. These were the eyes of someone who had witnessed his father's silent death, his mother's cold betrayal, and the fear that had gripped a nation under Roger Mortimer's shadow. No more regents. No more orders from behind the curtain. Only a throne that needed to be redefined, not merely by force, but by law, transparency, and a vision broader than any court had ever known. When Edward III took full control, he didn't pursue blind vengeance or rush to restore outdated systems. What he chose was reform, not loud, but like someone carefully tuning an old instrument gently, precisely, and patiently. He understood that if the throne was merely a seat for others to manipulate, the kingdom would spiral once more into chaos. So he started where few had looked before, the council chambers. No king before Edward had summoned parliament as frequently, but unlike his father, he didn't treat it as ritual. He treated it as a space for real listening. He wanted the nobles, bishops, even representatives of the merchant middle class to feel they were part of the monarchy, that their voices mattered, and that the royal court was no longer a sealed fortress delivering thunderous decrees from above. This was governance through psychology, making those in power feel they didn't need to conspire against the throne because they were already inside its circle. But he was no naive idealist. Edward knew all too well, a kingdom could not function if the nobles grew powerful enough to establish their own courts. And he had learned his lesson from Mortimer, the man who once manipulated the throne under the guise of protecting queen and child. So he began to streamline the feudal system. There were no mass executions. He didn't want to become a butcher, but he also wouldn't allow men with too much land and too many soldiers to behave like petty kings on their own estates. Land laws were revised. Local tax collection rights were curbed. Royal inspectors were sent out, and those who abused their power were dealt with quietly but effectively. For Edward, to rule did not mean to whip it, meant to guide everyone along the right path with the invisible thread of law and conditional loyalty. The royal administration was also revitalized with younger talent. Edward did not value birthright. he valued competence. If someone performed well, even if they were the son of a cobbler, they could sit at the table where the fate of the realm was decided. Records were kept more diligently. Language was standardized. And what was once chaos under Edward II gradually became a reliable system. The court, once a loose, emotional web, became a machine that could function independently of any one man's whims, and that was the foundation of future stability. Most importantly, Edward III understood that the greatest reform was reforming the image of the monarch himself. He could not be a king who merely sat on the throne reciting lofty words. The people had grown tired of rulers who never stepped onto battlefields, who didn't know the pain of a soldier, who held goblets instead of swords. So he put on armor. He went to war personally, in the battles against the Scots, and later in the early campaigns of the 100 Years' War with France. Edward did not send generals in his stead. He was the one leading. He camped with his troops, ate with them, fought alongside them, and returned with them to the cheers of victory. This wasn't just military strategy. It was a campaign for trust. Every victory was a declaration, "I am not my father." And step by step, he turned the throne from a rotting chair into a solid symbol of strength. Not the strength of fear, but of consent, of order, and of a king who understood that to rule for the long term, one must first rule oneself. In the early years of his reign, Edward didn't just restore a fallen throne. He redefined the meaning of kingship, a sovereignty not rooted in swords, but in statutes, not hidden in shadows, but laid bare in transparency, not barked from above, but earned through listening. And so, from a son placed on the throne as a pawn, Edward III gradually became one of the most respected monarchs in English history, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the only one in an age of chaos who understood this truth. A throne, if it is to last, cannot remain a symbol. It must be a commitment between king and people signed not in oaths, but in action. If politics is the pillar keeping the throne from tipping, then the economy is its foundation quiet. But décisif. Edward III understood that even the most beloved king would be replaced if not by violence, then by indifference, if he could not fill stomachs and stabilize the treasury. So after reforming the court, Edward turned his ear to the sound of money, not the clink of gold in royal vaults, but the murmur of markets, the hammer on anvils, the creak of cartwheels on dirt roads, and the anxious whispers of merchants weary of ever-changing tax policies. The post-Edward II English economy was like an old wagon grinding gears. Loose reins, worn wheels. Edward's first move wasn't to force it forward, but to oil it, part by part. He began with a seemingly simple decision: stabilize the tax system. During his father's reign, and especially under Mortimer, taxes had been imposed arbitrarily. People never knew what they'd owe next month. Nobles dodged payment, and merchants began withdrawing from domestic investment. Everyone lived in anxiety, and money never flowed where fear reigned. Edward changed that by establishing more fixed taxes based on seasons, industries, and most importantly, by taxing transparently. He issued royal decrees to each region, publicly announcing levies. This was new. No one had dared do it before. And the result, people began to plan their lives again. Certainty, even when it meant paying, was still better than instability. Next, he looked toward the sea where small sailboats struggled across the waves to Flanders, a region that was then the center of the textile world. Edward realized something: England had wool, and wool could feed an entire empire. Since the 14th century, England had vast sheep grazing lands, especially in Wales, Yorkshire, and the Midlands. But wool was typically exported raw to the continent. The real profit lay in processing a stage dominated by the Flemish and the Italians. So Edward made a bold decision. He offered tax incentives to wool merchants and encouraged the immigration of Flemish weavers to England. He invited them to towns like Norwich, Bristol, and especially London, promising land, tax exemption, and the right to live under their own laws. In return, they brought advanced weaving techniques, laying the foundation for England's first domestic textile industry. With this policy, England no longer exported. Only raw wool finished textile goods began to be produced locally. Money stayed within the borders. Jobs were created, and European traders began to look at England differently, no longer just a supplier of raw materials, but a serious economic rival. Alongside this, Edward III focused on developing the fair and market systems. Instead of merchants having to bribe their way into lands controlled by local nobles, he issued royal protection charters, allowing those with such documents to trade openly at major fairs, receive protection from royal soldiers, and be exempt from absurd local fees. Under this protection, cities like London, York, Bristol, and Southampton flourished. Merchants from Italy and from the Hanseatic League, a northern European trade alliance, it began docking more frequently at English ports. And for the first time in decades, England came close to a balanced trade. But Edward III didn't stop at internal commerce. He turned his attention to currency. Under his father, the silver coinage had been debased, making its value unstable. Common people no longer trusted coins, they preferred to barter. An economy in which people no longer believed in its own money was like a kingdom ruled by scraps of cloth. So Edward initiated a monetary reform, reminting silver coins to fixed standards, increasing checks on weight and quality, and most importantly, engraving his image clearly on the face of each coin. It was not just a legal guarantee, but a statement: this is the king's silver, and the king guarantees its worth. Trust returned, and when people began to use money with confidence, the market naturally flourished more than any royal decree could command. Edward III also did something rare for his time. He borrowed money from merchant financiers to invest in defense and infrastructure, and then repaid it in full. In an era when a king's loan is a king's forgetfulness, this was almost unheard of. But that very anomaly earned him lasting trust from financiers who would go on to fund his major military campaigns, including his early incursions into France during the 100 Years' War. All of these seemingly small measures led to something monumental. England began to form the first modern economy in European history. Not merely a kingdom surviving on land and taxes, but a machine that could generate wealth, expand, and sustain itself. And so, when night fell on the cobbled streets of London, the lanterns of merchants still flickered in the windows. Money still flowed. Wheels still turned. And trust, the most fragile thing in economics, had returned. One silver coin at a time. When a young king ascended the throne amid the ruins of the old regime, his first task was to hold that throne steady. But for Edward III, holding was not enough. He wanted to advance, expand, solidify, and to do that, there was nothing more effective than a loyal, strong, well-organized army, one that knew exactly who it was fighting for. Edward had watched his father suffer humiliating defeats on the battlefield. Catastrophes like Bannockburn against the Scots were not just territorial losses, they were blows to honor, dignity, and the credibility of the throne. He understood that if a king could not command his army, then, no matter how capable he was in court, he was nothing more than a puppet before wolves. So Edward III began a complete reform of England's military structure, not by swinging a sword in battle, but by redrawing every vein and artery of a modern fighting force. First came organization. Before his time, the royal army was often a patchwork of local lords, each bringing their own men, loyal more to themselves than to the king. In battle, this led to chaos. Each unit fought in its own way. There was no unified strategy, and if a lord was killed, his men would often flee. Edward changed that by professionalizing the force. He began paying soldiers, no longer relying solely on the loyalty of nobles. Mercenaries, professional cavalry, and skilled archers were contracted to fight. They were no longer Lord X's men or clan-wise retainers, they were the king's army. For the first time, the military structure gained top-down tactical unity. One of the weapons that defined Edward III in England for nearly a century after was the English longbow. This weapon wasn't his invention, but he was the one who elevated it to the backbone of national military strategy. Unlike the heavily armored French knights, English longbowmen were agile, mobile, and capable of bringing down a war horse from over 200 meters away. Edward recruited strong young men from rural regions, trained them in specialized camps, and turned them into terrifyingly accurate machines of war. He even instituted archery laws. Every village was required to have a practice range, and all able-bodied men had to train with the longbow on Sundays. Archery became more than a weapon, it became a way of life, a militarized cultural identity. In the minds of the people, England was the land of archers, a psychological weapon that couldn't be measured in gold. Edward also knew strength was not only in sword arms, but in feet. He improved light infantry models, allowing for faster movement, more flexible occupation, and strategic use of terrain. His tactics were no longer charge and clash. He structured his army in clear layers, archers at the front, cavalry guarding the flanks, heavy infantry in the center, and a mobile reserve in the rear. Battles became orchestras of steel and strategy, where every movement was calculated like a chess piece. A prime example of the effectiveness of these reforms was the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where the English, despite being outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, defeated a massive French force. It was here that English archers shattered the illusion of French knightly supremacy, and from that moment, Edward III's name echoed across Europe, not just as a king, but as a born commander. Yet an army could not run on morale alone. Edward knew this, so he reformed military logistics as well. Previously, soldiers had to fend for themselves or loot local villages. Now, he organized planned supply systems, with food wagons, rest stations, and procurement contracts in place before campaigns began. Troops were well fed, rewarded, and protected in their rights, and in return, they remained fiercely loyal. He also issued codes of military conduct to prevent royal soldiers from abusing power and terrorizing occupied areas. Violators could be executed on the spot. Edward's army was not a mob with royal permission. It was the moral instrument of the crown. From these reforms, England, once mocked by the French court and humiliated by defeats in Scotland, rose to become a military force in Europe. Other monarchs began to watch Edward with caution, and the English people, for the first time in decades, began to feel proud of their king. And so, when dawn broke after a long night of marching, when thousands of archers bowed before the young king riding past them on horseback, Edward III didn't need to speak. His presence alone, lit by the gleam of gold-plated armor, was enough for every soldier to understand they were fighting for something greater than territory. They were fighting for a new England. When Edward III took the throne, few commoners in England expected miracles. They had no time to think about politics, thrones, or glittering royal names. They were busy plowing fields, paying taxes, feeding families. To them, it mattered less who wore the crown than whether the grain was growing, the ovens burning, and whether this winter might yield one more sheep to sell. And yet, even without noticing, they could feel that change was coming. Not in a single night, but but in the way bread was no longer as expensive as the year before, in how taxes became more predictable, in the sight of royal soldiers no longer bursting into homes, demanding food for the war effort without payment, through reforms in administration, taxation, the military, and especially the economy. The lives of ordinary people under Edward III's reign began to shift quietly but steadily. Before that, under Edward II, peasants often lived under the near absolute power of landlords. They never knew how much of their harvest would be taken. They didn't know if their children would be conscripted or given up as human tax. But under Edward III, tangled laws were gradually unraveled. He issued clearer land decrees, defining the boundaries between royal lands, noble estates, and church property. Peasants now knew whom they owed, how much, and by when. It wasn't perfect fairness, but at least it was no longer a game without rules. The markets and trade fairs also thrived under Edward. With policies that protected merchants and regulated prices, commoners could now bring their goods to market without fear of extortion or arbitrary fees. Blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, once barely surviving from season to season, began to accumulate modest savings. Some even hired help. Gradually, a class of free craftsmen began to emerge, the early middle class. Another major change came from Edward's push to develop the domestic textile industry. This had enormous significance. Wool had long been an agricultural product, but in the textile industry, it became urban income. Small towns began springing up around dye houses, cutting workshops, and weaving mills. And with that, people no longer needed to depend on the nobility. They had trades, skills, and, over time, their own voices. As trade expanded and partnerships with the Hanseatic League German and Northern European merchants deepened, foreign goods began to flow into England's ports. People no longer saw just salt and ale, but began encountering spices from the East, exotic fabrics from France, and glassware from Italy. Not everyone could afford them, but they began dreaming of a different life, one not tied solely to the soil. Socially, a subtler shift was taking root: national pride. It might sound abstract, but imagine a young farm boy in Yorkshire hearing his father tell of the Battle of Crecy, where King Edward led the charge himself, where English soldiers triumphed over the mighty French. For the first time in generations, ordinary folk felt pride in being English, not merely as subjects, but as part of a nation that could overcome the strong. In village schools, children began learning stories of archers, of knights bearing St. George's cross, and of a king who didn't just sit in castles but rode at the front lines. Legends began to form, and quiet pride began to take root. And one must not overlook women. Under Edward III, women's roles in the economy became more visible. In weaving houses, they operated the looms. At market stalls, they were the ones selling, keeping ledgers. With social stability and clearer legal protections, more widows and unmarried women began opening shops, something nearly unimaginable in earlier generations. Of course, this era still held war, disease, and hardship. Life was far from easy, but the difference was people had hope that tomorrow wouldn't be worse than today. And for a society long haunted by instability, that was the greatest gift a king could offer. And when night fell, in thatched cottages, by the flicker of hearthlight, the farmer mended an old coat, the baker shaped dough for the next day, and a mother sang her child to sleep with tales of a king who rode into battle without fear. It wasn't just peace. It was the first light of a future blooming from once forgotten soil. History often remembers kings by the number of years they ruled, by their victories, their treaties, or sometimes by a cold stone in an ancient cathedral. But there are kings, though, long gone from the throne, buried deep beneath the earth, who still live in the way their people think of themselves. Edward III was one of them. Not because he was perfect. No, he had his faults, his personal ambitions, unfinished wars, and a royal family full of turmoil. But what made him an enduring symbol in the minds of the English was not his victories, but the way he awakened a quiet, long-slumbering pride in the heart of a people. Before Edward III, England had no clear national consciousness. People were loyal to their lords, their churches, their villages. But the idea of saying, "I am English," had never truly rung out. The country was a vague entity. There was a king. There were laws. There were borders, but no shared soul. And then, through military reforms, by personally leading the army of archers against French knights, by elevating the longbow into a symbol, Edward breathed something entirely new into England, the feeling of belonging to something greater than oneself. When a peasant heard news of the victory at Crécy, they didn't think about politics. They simply felt warmed by the knowledge that their king, the man who wore the crown far away in London, also knew how to shoot a bow, also slept in tents, also ate coarse black bread. And that feeling, that closeness, was where belief in a nation began to grow. Edward was also astute in using symbols to build identity. He revived and glorified the image of St. George, England's patron saint. The red cross on a white field, once a religious icon, gradually became a banner of loyalty. When the army marched to war, that flag led the way. When fairs opened, it hung above the gates. When knights swore their oaths, they placed their hands upon that cross and pledged to live and die with honor. And so, symbol and faith became intertwined. Edward also established the Order of the Garter, one of the oldest and most prestigious chivalric orders in the world. But unlike secretive power clubs, this order was founded on honor, loyalty, and the ethics of knighthood. Its motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, was more than a defense of dignity. It was a warning against division, suspicion, and intrigue. In an age when politics had been shaken by secret alliances and mysterious regicides, Edward III understood that trust could not be built on blood, but on pride. Under his reign, that pride was planted from countryside to court. The common soldier began to feel part of victory. The weaver felt their labor contributed to the nation's economy. The village priest, praying in a modest chapel, he began adding to his prayer, "God bless England and King Edward." Of course, not everyone loved him. History is a tapestry of many colors. And Edward made controversial decisions, especially in his later years. When war dragged on and taxes rose again, but his deeds were not washed away in anger. On the contrary, they crystallized into a layer of collective memory where the people began to feel connected to the idea of England as a spiritual home. And that was his greatest legacy. Not castles, not military triumphs, not bars of gold in the royal treasury, but the belief that the English could be won, whether from pasture, mina, or palace. When Edward III died in 1377, England had been changed forever. He was buried at Westminster Abbey, in a tomb not as lavish as those of some other monarchs. Yet, strangely enough, from that moment on, every king who followed him had to ask themselves, can I live up to Edward? And in every crisis that came after civil wars, famines, revolutions, the image of Edward III was recalled as a symbol of order, of true leadership, and of a monarchy that once listened to the heartbeat of its people. When Edward III took his final breath in June 1377, England did not shake with gunfire or rebellion. He passed away at Sheen Palace, a peaceful place, not on a battlefield or amid treachery like his father. Not betrayed, not stabbed in the back, not deposed, Perhaps that alone was a victory in itself. He had ruled for 50 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. But the strange thing was, the moment he closed his eyes was when people began to feel afraid. Not because Edward was the only one who could keep the realm together, but because he had set a standard so high that no successor could easily reach it. His heir was his grandson, Richard II, only 10 years old. Richard's father, Edward the Black Prince, the man expected to inherit all the glory of the king, had died just 1 year earlier. And so, England, from being led by a seasoned monarch, suddenly passed into the hands of a child, all while the 100 Years' War still raged on. This was a turning point, the beginning of cracks in a brilliant legacy. Outwardly, England remained strong, but internally, seeds of unrest were quietly taking root. First was the matter of regency. Richard II was too young to rule, so real power fell to his royal uncles, especially John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edward III's third son, and thus, much like the shadow of Roger Mortimer in the past, a court behind the throne began to form once more. People whispered once again, "Someone is ruling in the king's name for their own gain." Everything Edward III had tried to safeguard through transparency and trust now stood at risk of being swept away by hidden rivalries within the branches of the Plantagenet house. Next came the pressures of war. Though Edward III had been strong, the war with France had never truly ended. After him, England became bogged down in expensive campaigns, and as the treasury emptied, the crown resorted to raising taxes without ever asking the people. In 1381, just 4 years after Edward's death, something unprecedented happened: a peasants' revolt. History calls it the Peasants' Revolt, the uprising of Wat Tyler, in which peasants, craftsmen, and laborers from across southern England marched on London angry, organized, and for the first time demanding to speak with the king. Officials were attacked, tax records burned, and the black flag was raised with the rallying cry. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, it was a seismic declaration: all men are born equal. The revolt was crushed, but from that point on, the belief that the people will always obey had vanished. And then, the very thing Edward had feared most came to pass: division within the royal house. His descendants, the houses of Lancaster and York, began to quietly vie for power, land, and influence at court. Political marriages fell apart. Old promises were forgotten. And then, about 60 years after Edward's death, England plunged into a brutal civil war, the Wars of the Roses, a conflict lasting over 30 years, killing tens of thousands, and ending with the fall of the Plantagenet dynasty. So, when we look back, the death of Edward III was not merely the passing of a man, it was the end of a century of order, where kingship was still tied to the character of the king. After him, the throne became fragile. The court grew crowded with people, but thin on trust. And the dreams of the people gradually ceased to align with the dreams of the king. Yet, the spiritual legacy of Edward III did not vanish. It hides in the insignia of the British Army, still bearing the longbow and the cross. It lives in the Order of the Garter, which continues to knight individuals to this very day. And it echoes in the stories told whenever the English remember a time when they were a united people, strong and capable of walking through war not with brutality, but with order, dignity, and self-respect. And now, when all has quieted, when the lights in the palace halls are dimmed, when the royal banner has been lowered to half-mast for the funeral, somewhere in the heart of that country, people still speak his name, not with weeping, but with a sad smile. We once had a king who listened. We once had an England we were proud of. When a reign ends, people often count victories, edicts, castles built, enemies vanquished. But the true worth of a king does not lie in numbers. It lies in the soft imprint he leaves on the national memory, things that cannot be measured or weighed, yet remain forever. Edward III was not only a long-reigning monarch, he was the man who reshaped what England felt like at a time when the country was blurred by factions, fragmented by interests, and shattered by betrayal. Before him, the English were a scattered people. Those in Kent felt no kinship with those in Yorkshire. Those in London saw the folk of Cornwall as from another world. But under Edward, something began to bind them, not with force, but with symbol. He didn't force loyalty to the nation. Instead, he gave them reasons to choose it for themselves. When Edward rode into battle, he personally raised the banner of St. George. He didn't wield it only as a military signal, but as a cloth of spiritual unity. Gradually, the flag no longer belonged only to the army. It began to appear at festivals, on public buildings, in church ceremonies, and thus, the English began to see themselves beneath the same colors, something that had never happened before. One of the most enduring values Edward left behind was the idea of royal responsibility. To him, kingship was not about privilege, it was about burden. To stand at the front, to endure the pain first, and to remain upright when everything around was falling apart. That's why he never hid behind ministers during war. That's why he descended into camps, ate with his soldiers, slept in tents during winter, and never forgot to thank them after every victory. Today, we call that leading by example. But Edward III lived that truth 7 centuries ago. Another value rarely discussed, but quietly powerful, was his belief in moral order. Edward never used blood to secure his throne. After toppling Mortimer, he didn't massacre the opposition like many tyrants of the age. He did not kill his mother. Though she had betrayed his father, he did not seek revenge, but laid new foundations. It was through this restraint that he earned the trust of the nobility and of the people who were weary of blood-stained reigns. In an era where law often served the powerful, Edward III initiated a style of governance grounded in minimum fairness, not perfect, but trustworthy. The things he built: transparent taxation, clear administrative systems, a cooperative model of parliament, did not vanish with him, but laid the groundwork for England's later constitutional thought. Even in religion, a domain many kings used to suppress, Edward did not impose belief, but used faith as a moral foundation for the nation. The Order of the Garter he founded bore no ecclesiastical weight. It was a vow of honor between individuals. No clergy, only commitment. And that, for the medieval age, was a strangely progressive step. Culturally, he was the one who sparked pride in the English language. Before Edward's reign, French was the language of court. Documents were written in Latin, but he began shifting some official texts into common English so that the native intellectuals and merchants could access them not long after his death. This laid the groundwork for the birth of poetry, storytelling, and legislation in the mother tongue, no longer dependent on clergy fluent in Latin. That's how Edward III didn't just rewrite governance, he rewrote the national consciousness. He did not build an empire, but he awakened the seed of a nation. And when you think of Edward III, you might not remember all the battles, all the laws, all the reforms, but you'll remember that there was once a king who lived to listen. A king who trusted poor archers more than wealthy knights, who chose what was right over what was easy, who placed his hand over his chest when his soldiers shouted, "God save the king," not in pride, but as a reminder to be worthy of it. That is the legacy that remains. Not the glory, not the crown, but the kindness of power. And now, as you lie still beneath your warm blanket, eyes gently closing, heart slowly settling, let your soul carry just one soft truth. If power is in your hands, use it to listen. If you are called to lead, bow first to truth. And if ever you are chosen to reign, even over a small corner of someone's life, do it with honor and with grace. Sleep deeply. And if you dream of a golden armored king walking across a windswept field, smile gently, for perhaps that is Edward, nodding and greeting a keeper of dreams who once lived truly for the role he was given.